All right, Shabbos say good morning, good morning. Let us begin a good morning. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei Abalin Latova, Yolan Sar Kalman, celebration of completing Seder Nezikin, and for Besoros Tabos for Am Yisrael, and Nathan Perry Smith, in the schos of the entire Kehillah. Today's day, and of course we always dedicate honoring in the schos of our precious hostages. Mechelash Baruch Hu, Hashem, bring them home b'shalom and the karav and the merit of our holy soldiers. Mechelash Baruch Hu, allow them to be successful b'chol ma'asei yedeihem. Of course, Besoros Tabos and Shalom for all of Am Yisrael. Today's daf is daf Chavav. We are picking up a lot of ground to cover. We are picking up Emirat Hashem on Chav Ham base 25b Tnan Hasam, the last of the short lines. So remember again, we'll say our topic over here is still the topic of airspace of a kli. What is the status ultimately again in the airspace of a utensil? So the Gemara says this: Tnan Hasam. We learn there nasan yada o raglo o ali yirakos kadesh yavru mayim lechabis psulin. So what's the halacha? So back to paraduma. So if a person goes ahead, there's water flowing. So remember again, paraduma has to be mayim chayim, has to be spring water. So the halacha is, if ultimately, again, there's any human intervention in the flowing of the water, it disqualifies the water. So in this case over here, the water is flowing, but a person goes ahead and puts their hand or their foot in a way to channel the water. O ali yarakos, or vegetable leaves. In all of these cases, the water is possible. We'll see why that is in just a moment. Ali kanim va'ali egozim kshera. But if you use the leaves, reed leaves, or of the nut, it's kosher. Now, what's the reason? Zaklal, second white line, 25b. Zaklal, Davraham Makabal Tuma Psulin. Psulin. Davrashin Makabal Tuma Ksherin. Because the halacha is like this: something that is Makabal Tuma, if used to channel the water, ultimately disqualifies the water. Conversely, something that is not Makabal Tuma, if used to channel the water, does not disqualify the water. From where do we know this? So, Rabbi Yochanan b'Shnabi Yosef Abadamakra. Achmayon ubar mikva mayim yihye tahar. So this is very interesting because paraduma achmayon you could go ahead and use from a spring, ubar mikva mayim, or from some type of mikva, from some type of pit, yihye tahar, it will be tahar. So where darshins havyasan al yidei taharateh. Every part of the water process must be done in a state of ritual purity, including the channeling of the water, can only be done by things that are not mekabel tuma. What do you see from here? That the airspace of a utensil is just like the utensil itself. And again, just to clarify, so if you remember again, when we're talking about airspace, we're not talking about the airspace of the interior of the utensil, because as Rashi pointed out in yesterday's daf, once something comes into the interior airspace of the walls of the utensil, everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa, it is considered to be at rest in the utensil. When we say airspace, what are we referring to? Literally, again, the area above the utensil, the airspace above the utensil. The Gemara says, you see from here that the airspace above the utensil is like the utensil. The Gemara says, where do you see that? The Gemara says, so the fact that halacha l'maisa, if I channel the water with my foot or with my hand, ultimately the water is disqualified. We're assuming over here that what's happening is I'm channeling it in. The water is going into the airspace above the kli and then ultimately falling into the kli. Maybe the water ultimately is trickling in. Maybe there's not an airspace issue. Amalei Turde says that's crazy. That's not what it says. It says in order that the water will enter into the barrel. Based on the testimony of Rabbi Tzadok, we learn the following Mishnah. Distan Hayid Rabbi Tzadok al hazochalin shekilchan ba'aliyah goes and shem ksherin. And I will say there was the situation over here, same thing, waters of the paraduma, that were caused to flow ultimately again with ale egozin. Ale egozin literally again are like the leaves of a nut tree. The idea over here is they're not mekabel tuma, and therefore Allah Chalamaysa, the water remains kosher. Zeh hayamaisa, this actually occurred, ba'ahalya, in the city of a place of Ahalya. And ultimately it came before the Cham Lishkas Agazis, and they declared that the water itself was still going to be kosher for the use of paraduma. Incredible. So that concludes the sugya of Avir. So just to understand what's happened over here is the Gemara is trying to understand the concept whether or not airspace above a kli has the status of the kli itself. Obviously, once an item reaches the interior airspace of the kli, which means it's in the airspace of the walls, everyone agrees that it is considered to be at rest in the utensil itself. The shaila is in the airspace above the kli. Is it considered to be at rest in the kli? Now, interestingly enough, the Gemara's conclusion seems to be yes. So just something interesting to ponder again. We're not totally finished with that sugya yet, but the conclusion of the Gemara seems to be that avir akli is kikli dami. All right, so the Gemara goes right. Amravi. A very interesting case here. Hatzorim ozen hapar v'achar kach kibel dama apostle. So we'll say a fascinating case over here. A person goes ahead and shechts an animal, right? Shechts an ox or a sheep. After he shechs the sheep, but ultimately before he goes ahead and does Kabbalah, he nicks the ear of the sheep. Okay? So shchita, obviously this guy's very fast, right? So shchita nicks the ear of the sheep. What's the concept of nicking the ear? He does something that would normally constitute a mum, meaning a blemish. In other words, if let's say the animal before shchita were to have a nicked ear, that would preclude it from being used as a carbon. So in this case over here, what he did was, he did shchita, then he blemished the animal, and then he did Kabbalah. So the blemishing was done after shchita, between shchita and Kabbalah. What's the status of the animal? Puzzle. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Zera says, it's puzzle. The name of Rabbi is puzzle. Shneimar, v'lakach midam hapar, par shahaya kevar. So the pasuk says, when you do Kabbalah, you have to take from the dam of the par. What does it mean, hapar? The par as it was before, meaning just as the par at the time of the shechita had to be unblemished, so too the par at the time of the Kabbalah has to be unblemished as well. And if the par at the time of the Kabbalah is blemished, even though that blemishing took place after the shechita, the animal itself is precluded from use. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Ashkechan Kachay Kadosh. Fine. So that's the pause by Kachay Kadoshim. Kachim Kalim Minol. And how do I know that this is true? By lower sanctity Karbanas Kachim Kalim. Amarava Tanya Set Tamim Zachar Ben Shana. Karban Bezach. Torah says that ultimately you have to use a complete sheep, a Tamim sheep, male, 1 year old. What do you see from here? Shehei Tamim Uben Shana. B'shas shchita, that ultimately, again, the animal must be literally 1 year old, unblemished, and male at the time of the shchita. B'kabbalah, b'holacha, b'zrika minayin. How do you know that this is true? By the other parts of the carbonic process. Tamulomar yihiyah. Therefore, the pasuk says, it shall be, kol habiosav lo yuhu elatam uben shana. You see from here that, again, Abosai, at every stage of the sacrificial process, the animal must be in the same level of intactness that it was at the time of the shechita. So just like at the time of the shechita for Karban Pesach, it had to be unblemished, it had to be male, it had to be 1 year old, so too at every stage of the process, it must maintain those same characteristics. Incredible. Says Abaye, Zekasha Bishua Omer, Kolas Zevachim Shebetar Shnishtaim, and Kizayis Basar, or Kizayis Chelev, Zorik Es Adam. So we'll say, the Gemara says, any carbon, let's say something happened to the carbon, right? As long as there's left a kazayis of flesh or a kazayis of chelev, you're able to do zrika. Then we'll say, what do you see from here? You see from here that obviously if that's occurring, something happened to the carbon. So that contradicts what we just said before. We just said before that at every stage of the sacrificial process, which is shchita, kabbalah, holacha, zrika, the animal must be fully intact, as it was at the time of the shchita. Here it's clearly saying that that is not the case. How do you reconcile this? To which the Gemara says, Tirgama aben shana. No, by Karban Pesach Rabosai, this is very interesting. The only part ultimately, again, that has to remain, that has to be intact throughout the entire process, is the animal has to be 1 year old. So we'll say, so in other words, if something changed in the animal, let's say over the course of the sacrificial process of the Karban Pesach, the animal could still be kosher. As long as the animal is still 1 year old over the course of the entire process. To which the Gemara says, what? Is there any case where over the course of the sacrificial process, the animal could age? Remember again, when you Shet Karban Pesach, everything has to be done that same day. So if you started the day and the animal was 1 year old, then B'Pashtos what? It's going to have to be 1 year old the rest of the day. How could it ever age out over the course of the sacrificial process? So this is fascinating. Amarava Zosomeres. Rav says, what do you see from here? This teaches us Shos Poslos B'Kadshim. I will say this is fascinating. When it comes to the age of karbanos, of sacrificial items, age is not determined by what we call me'es la'es, by 24-hour periods. Age is actually determined both by the calendrical date as well as the hour in which the animal is born. So, for example, a 1-year-old sheep for Karban Pesach is determined by ultimately, again, the day that it was born and the hour it was born. So the moment that it comes to that, a year later, that same day and hour, even the animal ultimately ages out. So interestingly enough, you can actually have a Karban Pesach that ages out over the course of the sacrificial process. For example, you shechted it at 12 o'clock in the afternoon. It happened to have been that it was born at 12:15. So maybe the shechita and the Kabbalah were done ultimately again when it was still 1 year old. By the time you got to the Zrika, ultimately the animal has aged out. It's a fascinating idea. There's also a tremendous Musar Haskell in this. If you look at that Lashon Zosomeres, what does this teach us? Sha'os Poslos B'Kadshim. Whenever something is holy, holiness, kachim, requires an acute sensitivity to the use of time. That time is not only measured in days, but time is also measured in hours. In hours. And I will say that is true ultimately again for karbanos. Then Allah has kama v'kama how that is true for us as well. We are kachim. Right? There's nothing more sacred, there's nothing more sanctified than us, than a Jew, than a Yid, than a human being. And you see from here that again, when it comes to kachim, sha'os poslos. It's not just about how you use your days, although that is important. What is equally as important for anything that is kaddish is how you use your hours. Time management. I always reference this to Piazetzna. Piazetzna wrote the B'nai Machshava Tova that one of the most important things that is a secret to life success is scheduling, is in maintaining ultimately, again, a schedule of how I use my time, and not just how I use my days, but quite literally how I use my hours. For everything else, you measure time in days, but for Kadshim, for holy things, Sha'os Poslos, even the misuse of hours could chas v'shalom become the undoing of man. But let's phrase it in the positive. For Kadshim, one has to be careful not just how they use their days, but even how they use their hours. Amar Rabbi Ami, Amar Rabbi Lazar. Hasli Gemara says, Hi bifnim v'ragla b'chotz. What's the interesting case over here? What happens if the karban is inside of the Beis HaMikdash, but its feet are dangling outside? So what's the halacha? What should you do? You should first cut off the feet of the animal and then shech the animal. Okay, now I will say, obviously, even at first glance, that doesn't make any sense. We'll talk about this in just a moment. Now, I will say, what's the concern over here? We're going to see the concern is that if you shech the animal with its feet dangling out, the concern is like this. That means part of the animal was outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Blood flows through the body, which means now that there's blood of shchutei chutz, right? Which means the animal is slaughtered outside of the Beis HaMikdash, mixed with carbonic blood, right? Because the blood flows through the body of the animal. So the Gemara says, what's the only way to obviate that concern? Cut off the legs and then do the shechita. The Gemara says, 1 second, we're going to come back to that. Chatach, v'achar kach shachat, kshera. If you first cut off the legs of the animal, then you did shechita. Ultimately, the animal is kasher, top of chavav. Shachat, v'achar kach chatach, pas psula. But ultimately, again, if you shechted first, and then cut off the legs, the animal is possible. Now again, what's the logic behind that? Because if you shechted the animal and the legs were dangling on the outside, then the problem we have over here is there is external blood mixed in with sacrificial blood, what we call shchutei chutz, and that should invalidate the animal. Chatach v'achar kach shachat kshera. What? So you tell me now I should cut off the legs of the animal and then do shechita? How could that possibly be good? Bal mum kamakriv. Now let's say, if you cut off the legs of an animal, that renders the animal into a balmum. Once it's a balmum, it's no longer fit for use. So how can you advocate that? Elaima chatach, the Gemara says, Elaima chatach v'achakach kibel kasher, kibel v'achakach chatach psula. Rather, what it means is like this. If you went ahead and you first cut legs, in other words, let's say you did shchita, and then ultimately again after shchita, then you cut off the legs before Kabbalah, then it's kasher. But if you did Kabbalah, ultimately again before you cut off the legs, it's pasul. So the Gemara says, one second. Chatach v'achakach kibel kshera. How could that be? So we're going to talk about you're going to do shchita, cut off the legs, and then do Kabbalah. It's going to be kasher. V'amar v'zeira hatzorim ozen bebechar v'achakach kibel dama pasul shnemar v'lakach midam hapar par shahaya kvar. But that contradicts what we just said before. What do we say before? That the animal has to be in its fully unblemished state during all stages of sacrificial service, right? And again, the problem is if you're cutting off the legs before Kabbalah, that means by the time you get to Kabbalah, you have a blemished animal. No, what do you do? In other words, you cut the flesh up until you get to the bone. Now, what does that do? So that prevents blood flow. But ultimately, because the bone is intact, ultimately the animal is considered to be unblemished. Very interesting. So we'll say, but however, if you first did Kabbalah and then only afterwards cut off the legs, it's going to be pasul. Why? Shamas mina, what do you see from here? Dam hamuvla be'ivarim damhu. We'll say what you see from here is that halacha l'maisa, when blood is mixed in the limbs, ultimately again is considered to be one cohesive unit of blood. Because remember, what's the issue over here? The issue over here is because the legs are dangling outside. When you shech that animal, essentially what you have is you have two bloods, right? You have blood of a sacrificial animal in the Beis HaMikdash, and then you have blood from an animal slaughtered outside of the Beis HaMikdash. What's the problem? The blood flows. So now you have a mixture of that exterior blood with that interior blood, which invalidates the carbon. So the Gemara just says, obviously you see blood of an animal as one cohesive entity. Shamas mina, basar kachim kalim shiyaz lefnei zvikas tam pasul. We also see from here that again that the meat of kachim kalim that went out of the Beis HaMikdash before zrika ultimately again is going to be pasul. I says the Gemara, Dilma b'Kadshe Kadashim. Well, maybe not. I can't bring her over there because maybe we're just talking about Kadshe Kadashim. Okay, fascinating. So the Gemara goes like this. We'll say that's the end of that sugya. We'll say now I want to point out over here is the takeaway from this, right? There are a couple of different takeaways. So takeaway number one is that Aver Kli Kikli, that's what we spoke about before. Takeaway number two is that Halacha L'Maisa, an animal is supposed to be in its fully intact state during every stage of the sacrificial service. Takeaway number three is that Halacha L'Maisa, when gauging the age of a carbon, we don't just count days, but we also count hours, right? Takeaway number four is that Halacha L'Maisa, in this interesting case, where part of the animal is inside of the Beis HaMikdash, part of the animal is outside of the Beis HaMikdash, we're going to have a problem. How exactly you deal with that problem is a discussion, but L'maisa, we've got a problem. Why? Because when you slaughter that animal, now we're going to have a mixture of interior blood and exterior blood altogether. Okay, incredible. Let's go back to Turn on. Kadshe Kadashim, Shchitas Mitzafa. So we'll say beautiful Gemara over here. This is going to be reminiscent when we get to Parak Ezu Makoman. We're going to learn a lot about these halachas, about where different things were slaughtered. So Kadshe Kadashim. Remember again, our highest sanctity karbanos. Ultimately, Shchitas Mitzafon. They are shechted in the north of the Azara. This is the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash. The Kibel Daman, Klisharis Mitzafon, and you receive their blood in a service utensil, also in the northern part of the Azara. Amad Bedaram, Bahoshit Yadol Tzafon. What happens if the Kohen was standing in the south, but he extended his hand to the north, Vishachat, and he shechted. So we'll say, so interestingly enough, in this case over here, he's standing in the south, extends his hand to the north. So the animal ends up getting shechted in the north. What's talacha? Shchitas Okshera. It works. Kibel, what happens if halacha l'maisa he was standing in the south and did Kabbalah ultimately in the north? Kabbalah so psula. Such a Kabbalah ultimately again is going to be pasul. Hichnis Rosh Avarubo, if he went ahead and he put his head and the majority of his body into the north, Kilu Nichnas Kulo, it's as if he was fully there. Now, I'll say that's an interesting halacha. What that says is, if your head and most of your body is in a particular place, then it is considered to be as if the entirety of your body was there. Pirches v'yatza saladaram v'chazrak sheira. What happens if you slaughtered the animal in the north and then the animal convulsed? Pirches means it convulsed, and as a result, it moved to the south, but then it moved back into the north, ultimately kosher. Kadshe kadosh, kachim kalim. Next category, kachim kalim. Shchitasam bifnim. Ultimately, again, their shchita could take place anywhere inside of the azara. As long as it's in the azara, you're good to go. B'kibel daman b'kli sharis bifnim. And ultimately, again, they receive the blood. Kabbalah is done in a kli sharis in the azara. So we'll say, if you notice again, whereas kachim kalim has to be done in a particular part of the azara, namely the northern part, kadshe kadashim, lower sanctity, could be slaughtered anywhere, right? Shchita and Kabbalah could be done anywhere as long as it's in the azara. Okay, so if the kohen was standing outside of the azara, extended his hand into the azara, and did shchita like that, ultimately again it will be kosher. Kibel, Kabbalah sapsula, but if he was standing outside, extended his hand inside to do Kabbalah, that is going to be invalid. Hichnis rosho verubo. What happens if he extended his head and the majority of his body? In other words, he's standing outside, but he extended his head and the majority of his body inside. Ki'ila lo nichnas. That doesn't work, because since he's standing outside, even though he's extending the most of his body in the inside, it doesn't work. Pirkisa v'yatza salachotz v'chazra. What happens if, again, you shechted the kachim kalim in the azara, the animal convulsed. As a result, again, it moved itself out, but then it convulsed again and moved itself back in. Ultimately, it's possible. What do you see from here? Shmamina, basar kachim kalim shiatzat neizrikas tamim psulim. What do you see from here? That the meat of kachim kalim that left the azara before zrika ultimately is possible. The Gemara said, well, maybe not. Dilma ba'al yavi osar sakavadush teklayos. Maybe we said about the sacrificial parts. Sacrificial parts, and therefore if sacrificial parts went ahead and moved, enachinami, that's when it's going to be a problem. Maybe by other parts of the animal, it's not. Good. So the father of Shmuel asked Shmuel the following shayla. Hi bifnim, v'ragleha bachotz mahu. What happens ultimately again if the carbon, right? Feet are on the, right? The animal is on the inside, but ultimately again its legs are dangling outside. What's the halacha? Amar leiksiv. We learned this already. You have to bring it to Hashem. Ultimately, again, the entire animal has to be inside of the Beis Hamikdash at the time of Shechita. By the way, that's how we paskin. That's why it obviates a little bit the previous discussion. That halacha l'maisa, again, in order for a carbon to be valid, the entire animal must be inside. Now, what does inside mean? Again, these are important principles, which we'll see later on. For kachim kalim, lower sanctity karbanos, anywhere in the azara. Kadshe kadashim, north of the azara. Okay, again, we'll talk about all of this more. Talav v'shachat mao. So what's the interesting case? What happens if you suspended the animal and you shechted it like that? What's the halacha? The Gemara says, Amalei kshera, answer this kasher. Amalei ishtabashta. He said, I think you're making a mistake, because ba'inon shchita al yerech v'leka. You do need shchita to be done in proximity to the mizbeach, and ultimately, again, you're missing that if the animal is suspended. Nitla v'shachat now. So this is an interesting case. What happens if the shochet was suspended? Shochet was suspended. Don't ask how. Don't ask how, right? It's just, he was, right? He suspended it. I remember Gemara say, the Gemara always asks hyperbolic questions in order to isolate a point. So let's say again, whatever the case is, right? There's a little bit of Purim shtick, and his friends are, hoisting him up in the air. So ultimately, he's suspended. So and then he checks what's the status of the shchita. Amarle psula. He said ultimately it's pasul. Amarle ishtabash said, I think you're mistaken. Shchita al yerech v'lo shachot al yerech. It's just the shechita has to happen by the side of the mizbeach, but there's nothing that says that the shochet has to be by the side of the mizbeach. So as long as the animal is in the right proximity, it doesn't seem like the shochet needs to be in the right proximity. And therefore, even if he's suspended mid-air, halach and shechts like that, halach l'maisa, it should be good. Nitle v'kibel mahu. What happens if he's suspended and he does Kabbalah? What's the halacha? Amarle kshera. Ultimately, it's kasher. Amalei ishtabashta. He says, I think you're wrong. Ein derech sheirus bekach. That is not a normative way to do a service. In other words, that's not bakavadik. Kabbalah, remember again, is one of the sacrificial services. We also remember again, going back, shchita is not part of the avoda. How do we know that? Because shchita is kshera even bizarre, even by a non-Kohen. So therefore, to do shchita when suspended might be fine. But to do Kabbalah when suspended is not going to work. That's not the way to do avoda. Tala vikibel mahu. What happens if the animal was suspended and he did Kabbalah? Amrle psula, said it's possible. Amrle yishtabashta. So I think you're mistaken. Shchita al yerech velo Kabbalah al yerech. Only shchita has to be done by the side of the mizbeach. Kabbalah doesn't have to be done like that. But say first wide line, Chavav Amadalef, Amar Abaye, B'Kadshe Kadoshim Kulam Psulos. So in general, when it comes to Kadshe Kadoshim, all of these cases are going to be possible, bar minitla v'nish v'shachat, with one exception. One exception, which is if the shochet is suspended. If the shochet is suspended and he shechs, it's fine. Otherwise, all the other cases, I will say all the other cases are, if the animal is suspended, right, that's not going to work because it requires shechita by the side of the mizbeach. Or ultimately, again, if the animal or the shochet are suspended for Kabbalah, because that's not the proper way to do the avoda. B'kachim kalim kulan ksheras. When it comes to kachim kalim, all the cases will be kosher. Bar min nitla v'kibel, with one exception, if the animal was suspended and Kabbalah was done. What's different ultimately, again, if the coin is suspended and does Kabbalah, b'kachim kalim v'kshera, the avir pnim kipnim dami. Because ultimately, again, the airspace of the interior is still like the exact interior. But in that case, by Kadshe Kadoshim, we should say that the airspace of the northern side of the Azara is the same as the actual northern side of the Azara. Amar Rabbi, you're right. Bein b'Kadshe Kadoshim, bein b'Kachim Kalim Ksheros. In all cases, these situations will be kosher, with the exception of bar min tala v'shachat b'kadshe kadoshim. The only exception will be suspending the animal and shechting it. That won't work by kadshe kadoshim. Nitle v'kibel. Similarly, again, ultimately, again, if the shochet himself was suspended and did Kabbalah, bein b'kadshe kadoshim, bein b'kachim kalim. Ultimately, I will say everyone will agree in that case it's going to be possible as well. Why? Ein derech sheirus bekach. Because it's not an appropriate form of service. So Rabbi Yomi asked Rabbi Zera the following. So who bifnim v'tzitzasa b'chutz ma'u? So it's an interesting case. What happens if the kohen is standing inside of the Beis HaMikdash, but his hair extends out of the Beis HaMikdash? Okay? So again, which means just he's got a stray hair, right? Or a little bit of a longer hair, and it's extending out of the Beis HaMikdash. So what is the halacha? Because you also remember again, if a kohen does the avodah outside of the Beis HaMikdash, the avodah is possible. What about in this case where he's got a hair extending out? Amrle lav amrit vehevium laHashem ad shetava kula lifnim. So ultimately, again, the pasuk says it will be brought to Hashem until the entirety is brought on the inside. Hachanami bevoam el oel moed ad sheyavo kulo li oel moed. So too the pasuk says over here when they come to the oel moed. Ultimately, again, until everything comes to the Oel Moed. So also, interestingly enough, halacha l'maisa, the Gemara says, if one of the hairs of the kohen is extending outside of the Beis HaMikdash, ultimately, again, the avodah is going to be possible. Okay? Even if I am a kohen, nothing I have to worry about. I will say, but again, but l'maisa, interestingly enough, now obviously, where does that come up? That's only going to come up in a situation where halacha l'maisa, you're standing by the edge of the Azara, right? If you're standing on the inside, nothing to be worried about. Good. Mishnah. Nasna gabi hakevesh lo kineged eisa. So some other interesting cases over here. Let's say they went ahead and they placed the sacrificial meat on the kevesh. Kevesh is the ramp. Shelo kineged hayisor. Now, we haven't seen any of these halachas yet, right? In other words, what we just did see over here, and again, these are good facts just to keep with you along our journey, right? So again, what do we have? What we have is, number one, Kadshe Kadoshim are slaughtered in the northern side of the courtyard. Kachim Kalim are slaughtered anywhere in the courtyard. Now, I will say, interestingly enough, we're switching gears over here to the blood application, Zrika. So Zrika, let's say Zrika was done on the ramp and not by the Yisod. The Yisod is the base of the Mizbeach. What we are going to see is that there is like a like a trim, or a little bit of a base along part of the Mizbeach, not the entirety of the Mizbeach. That's where Zrika is supposed to be done. So in this case over here, you did Zrika on the ramp and not by the base. Or Nasan es hanitana lamato lamala ves hanitana lamala lamata. So also, for example, we're going to see there was also what we call a chut sikra, a red line that ran across the Mizbeach. Some blood applications are done above the line, some are below the line. In the Mishnah we're talking about over here, where you made a mistake, you did something that was supposed to be below, above, something above, below, or bifnim b'chutz, or certain blood applications are done inside of the heichal, some are done outside of the heichal. You messed it up. Point over here is in all of these cases, you did an inappropriate blood application. You made a mistake. What's the halacha? Pasal ve'ein bo kares. In all of these cases, obviously the avoda is going to be pasal because you did it wrong. But ultimately, again, you're not subject to kares for your infraction. Says the Gemara, we'll say Amud Beis. Amar Shmuel. Shmuel says pasal basar aval bailim niskapru. This is very interesting. Shmuel says in all of these cases, so bottom line, in these cases, you did this zrika wrong. So when you do this zrika wrong, what does the Mishnah say? The carbon is pasal. Shmuel says, what does it mean pasal? Pasal means you can't eat the sacrificial meat. The meat is pasal, but the carbon affects atonement. Wow, that's good news. So the Gemara says, my time, what's the reason? Because the pasuk said, Vani nesativ lachem lechaper al mizbeach. So the Gemara says, because the pasuk says, I have given this to you to atone on the altar. Kevan shegia dam lemizbeach niskapru bailim, which tells me what? As long as the blood reaches the mizbeach, even if what? It's the wrong spot on the mizbeach, kapara has been accomplished. Atonement has been accomplished. So again, can't eat sacrificial meat, but as long as that blood has arrived at the correct space, then halacha l'maisa, ultimately, again, atonement is done. Ihaki, if that's the case, basar nami, if that's the case, then ultimately, again, I don't understand, then the meat should be fine as well. Why would the meat not be good? Because the pasuk says l'chaper, l'chapar nasativ lo davar acher. Because again, the pasuk says essentially, once it's reached the mizbeach, ultimately l'chaper. For kapara, it works, but for anything else, it does not. And therefore, as long as that blood reaches the mizbeach, kapara has been achieved, but ultimately, again, the meat is going to be invalid for consumption. Incredible. Alma, what do you see from here? Alma kasavar, shalobim komo, kim komo dami. What do you see from here? That halacha l'maisa, shalobim komo, kim komo dami. That ultimately, again, when blood reaches the mizbeach, even if it's not the right spot, it has the status of the right spot. Incredible. Tanan be'idach. So what's Tanan be'idach parkim? We learned different parak. Nasnu ala kevesh shelo keneged hayisod. If you place the blood on the ramp, not opposite the base of the mizbeach, or nasan es hanitana lamata lamalo, or both say you have certain blood applications which were supposed to be done on the top part of the mizbeach and you did it on the bottom, or es hanitana lamala lamata, right? Or you went ahead and you decided it was done on the bottom, but you did it above. You again placed it on the wrong spot of the mizbeach, or ves hanitana bifnim b'chutz, ves hanitana b'chutz bifnim. Or there was a blood application that was supposed to be done inside of the Beis HaMikdash. You did it on the outside, or on the outside, on the inside. What's the halacha? Im yesh dam hanevesh yachzor hakasher v'yikabel. Suppose it's incredible. What does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says, if there is any lifeblood, which means the blood from Kabbalah left over, what should you do? You should go and you should reapply it. That contradicts what we just said before. What did we just say? So what did we just say? That essentially, as long as the blood reaches the mizbeach, even if it's the wrong spot, which essentially means, even if the blood reaches the wrong spot, as long as it got somewhere sacred, you're good to go. You need not repeat the service. At most, Shmuel says kapara has been achieved. At worst case scenario, the meat can't be consumed. Here the Mishnah says, what do you have to do? You have to repeat the process. As long as there's more lifeblood, you have to do it again. So what's going on over here? But if halacha l'maisa again, that we hold that even if it got to the wrong place, as long as it got to a sacred place, ultimately you're good to go, then why does a kasha person have to go ahead and do Kabbalah again and reapply the blood? So we say, no. Maybe the only reason we would require another blood application is why? To permit the meat for consumption. Right? Kapara has already been accomplished. But if you want to permit the meat for consumption, you should go ahead and do this service again, do the blood application again. That doesn't make any sense. Why? I don't understand. Is there any such thing as a zrika that doesn't affect kapara and does allow for meat consumption? So what you would be saying is that second zrika doesn't do anything for kapara because kapara was already accomplished. But then what? The second zrika is going to allow for meat consumption? We have no such concept like that. Kasha, so Gemara says, you're right. What's the case? The case of the Mishnah Avosai is where the blood application was done by someone who's disqualified, by someone who's not kosher. That's the case. Whatever the case was, a non-Kohen, a Kohen Pasul, whatever it was, let's just go with the Kohen Pasul. That's the case. So a Kohen Pasul did this zrika, right? So now the Mishnah says, if you have more life blood, or you could do more Kabbalah, right? More life blood, have a kosher Kohen come and do the zrika again. To which the Gemara says, how come I'm asking what's the case over here? The Yahweh Pasul. Oh, wow. The case of say ultimately over here is where halacha l'maisa, the initial blood application was done by someone who is pasul, a pasul Kohen. Gemara says, 1 second. So I'll say, now, by the way, you hear what the Mishnah is saying? If a Kohen who was pasul did this rika, what should you do? As long as there's more life blood, get a kosher Kohen to go ahead and do the whole thing again. Gemara says, what are you talking about? The Gemara says, I don't understand. Isn't that called dichui? What does dichui mean? Dichui means once something is invalid, essentially, it's permanently invalid. So wouldn't we say over here that halacha l'maisa, once a non-kosher Kohen went ahead and did zrika, doesn't that permanently disqualify the carbon? After all, this time we learned, v'kulan shekiblu chutz lizmano v'chutz limkomo. So we'll say, listen to this. If any pasul, right, any person who is pasul, or any Kohen who is pasul, ultimately again, did Kabbalah with intention to go ahead and eat the carbon outside of its prescribed time, or chutz limkomo, or to eat the carbon outside of its permitted place. Im yesh dam hanefesh yachsra kosher v'yikabel. Ultimately, again, if there is halacha l'maisa still lifeblood, so what should happen, Abosai? So then a kosher should come and do Kabbalah again. But Abosai, so I just want to point out very specifically, what's the case over here? The case over here is where you have someone who is disqualified, who is doing Kabbalah. At the time of the Kabbalah, he has in mind to either eat the carbon outside of the permitted time or outside of the permitted place. So in that case, if there is someone kosher, let that person do another Kabbalah. Now, why could this be rectified? Why? Because this qualification is taking place at the time of Kabbalah before Zrika. So if something went wrong at the time of Kabbalah, in other words, if you have a pasul who did Kabbalah, you could rectify that by a kasha doing Kabbalah. Kiblu in, zarkulo. Once Zrika was done by a pasul, ultimately, that cannot be rectified. My time, what's the reason? Mishum dahavi dichui. Because Rabbi say, once Zrika was done by a pasul, then what? We're done. We're done. There's no way to rectify that. To which Rabbi say, so how could it be? I said, which conscience we just said before? Because we said before, it sounded like that if somebody who was pasul did Zrika, someone else could come along and redo the Zrika. To which the Gemara says, Lo mishum de pasul b'machshava. That's not the case. Ultimately, again, the reason is because halacha l'maisa, he puzzled it with erroneous thought. If that's the case, ihachi kabbalah nami. Well, if that's the case, that machshava zara, erroneous thought, invalidates the carbon, so then even if a pasul did kabbalah, that should undermine the effectiveness of the carbon. Furthermore, again, the Gemara says, mi pasla machshava, does erroneous thought of a pasul invalidate a carbon? But say, watch this. Rava said, ein machshava mo elas ela b'mishrei la'avoda, or b'davar la'avoda, or b'makom la'avoda. Both say an invalid thought only goes ahead and invalidates a carbon when, number one, it has to be a Kohen who is fit to do the avodah with sacrificial material that is permitted, that is fit for carbonic purposes, and in a place in which avodah could happen. Which means, Rabbosai, if someone who is pasal has an erroneous thought that does not invalidate the carbon, to which the Gemara says, you're right. Lo tema zarko, lo ela ema shachto lo. So we'll say, what are we talking about? So the Gemara says, you're right. So the Gemara says, look, if you look at Rashi, Rashi's in the wide lines. In the wide lines, about 8 lines in. Lo tema zarko lo, devada ika takanta, vafidu zarko, pasal b'machshava. So we'll say, interestingly enough, ela ema shachto lo, shim shachta pasal machshava, Sula katakanta, the chayvin the call of shem lishchot psulin and machshavtim. So this is very interesting. You're right. If someone who is puzzle ultimately again did zrika, so ultimately the Gemara seems to suggest that machshava zara, his erroneous mindset can't invalidate the zrika. Why not? Because since he's not fit for zrika, therefore his erroneous mindset can't undo the zrika. But interestingly enough, I will say, if someone has, let's say a puzzle has erroneous mindset by shchita, that can invalidate the carbon. Why? Because since everyone is kosher to do shchita, therefore an erroneous mindset by shchita undermines the carbon. So essentially, I will say, you could only mess up something with an erroneous mindset if you have the power to engage in that activity. But if you don't have the power to engage in that activity, then your erroneous mindset ultimately, again, cannot go ahead and cannot undermine the effectiveness of that carbon. So the Gemara says, good. So lo tem zarko ela emo shachtu lo. So my kamashmalan. So what is it teaching me? The pasal machshava, that ultimately again that machshava undermines shchita. We learn this tanina. The ficha chein posel machshava. Hakamashmalan de mikabala ve'elach lo pasal machshava. My tamekidirava. So this is very interesting. So a very important fact here. What's the important fact? That if a person who is pasal does the avoda and has a pasal machshava by the avoda, so again, that pasal machshava by the avoda only invalidates an avoda that he is fit to do. But if you're not fit to do it, your machshava can't undermine it. So therefore, again, for example, if let's say someone who is pasal does the zrika, which obviously is illegal, and he has an erroneous mindset by the zrika, he doesn't undermine the zrika. Why? Because since he's not allowed to do it, his pasal mindset can't invalidate the carbon. However, if someone who is pasal does the shchita and has an erroneous mindset by the shchita, that can invalidate the carbon. Why? Because shchita is kosher by everyone. So since he's allowed to do the shchita, ultimately again, his mindset invalidates the shchita. Shabbos, if you think about it, is a tremendous musar. Essentially what it says is like this. Power of thought, right? Thoughts only have power over something you control. But if you don't control it, ultimately, again, then your thoughts have absolutely no impact on it. So I will say, so first of all, in general, I think there's two profound Musar Haskels that come from this. Number one is we spend a lot of time focusing on things that we do not control. Right? We spend a lot of time focusing. We worry about the future, worry about this, we worry about a variety of different things that we don't control. At the end of the day, your thoughts have no power over things you can't control. So why spend time worrying about things you can't control? Instead, focus your energy at the end of the day on things you can control. Rabbi Nachman, whose yahrzeit is today, so the Rebbe says so beautifully, Moshe Rabbeinu says to Klal Yisrael, V'ata Yisrael, so Moshe Rabbeinu says, and now, Klal Yisrael, what does Hashem ask of you? What does Hashem ask of you? Kiyim liyira, to fear him, to revere him. The Rebbe says that's not what it means. What it means is like this: V'ata Yisrael, ma'Hashem elokech shoma. Klal Yisrael, what does Hashem ask of you? V'ata. What is v'ata? It's ata with an ayin. What does that mean? Now. All Hashem asks of you in life is to be the best person you can in the here and now. Hashem does not ask you for guarantees about your future. For one simple reason. You can't guarantee the future. I can't guarantee what's going to happen in 5 minutes from now. I can't guarantee that we're going to finish Shir on time, right? But I can go, I can, but I'm not. Right? I'll say, but at the end of the day, there's only one thing in life that we control, which is the here and now. And that's all that Kadosh Baruch Hu asks of us. Don't spend your time worrying about the things that you can control. There's a famous Maimar Chazal that says, don't stop thinking about tomorrow, right? Well, halacha l'maisa, that is false. That is false. Stop thinking about tomorrow, because at the end of the day, you can't really control it. We spend so much time focusing on the things that we don't control instead of putting our focus on the things that we can control. Number two, and with this we'll stop, we spend so much time worrying about what other people think about us. And the truth is, you can't control the thoughts of other people. So therefore, the Gemara teaches us, thought only invalidates in processes that you control. I can't control what other people think. I can't control what other people feel. So I might as well simply stop worrying about it altogether. Machshava is only impactful in areas that are under your sphere of influence. I can't control the future, so you might as well stop worrying about it. And I can't control what other people think or feel, might as well stop worrying about it. Ultimately, says the Gemara, says Rabbi Nachman Zchusi Yagen Aleinu, use your thoughts to focus on the areas that are under your sphere of influence. Use your machshava to ultimately maximize your present. Use your machshava ultimately, again, where it could truly have an impact. We'll say, Shkoyach, stop here. By the way, good run today. Excellent run today, Shkoyach. Great job. Great job. Good Erev Shabbos, a good Mayit. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a great day, everyone. Good Shabbos, a good Mayit. Beautiful. Beautiful. Jerry, there's still time for us to get to you for Shabbos. Amir Hashem. And famous Sharon. Anything could happen. Yeah.
The Gemara says that it's not the therapy shari, so he's suspended. Isn't it possible? Standing on the wrist.